so glad to have you all with me here today. It is amazing how technology allows us to get together regardless of the amount of space between us, so we can bridge our divides and exchange our ideas. The technological revolution is changing our world. Every establishment is being disrupted and revolutionized, from our education to our medicine, from the way we grow our food to our economy. The coronavirus pandemic has amplified that change. Now, to face all these uncertainties, a shift in our way of life becomes inexorable. My guest today, Dr. Saleh Nsouli, understands change. He learned to embrace it since his young age. He's lived in many countries, had to change many schools, and in the process, mastered several languages. Academically, Dr. Nsouli holds a BA in economics from the AUB and a doctorate in economics from Vanderbilt University. He has published several books dealing with macroeconomics, program design, and financial programming, among other topics. He has also published numerous articles in academic journals on international trade theory, monetary policy, and exchange rate policy. Dr. Nsouli has lectured widely around the world. As a renowned international economist, Dr. Nsouli has held numerous senior positions at the IMF. Throughout his career, Dr. Nsouli has kept a worldly outlook on the issues at hand. He reads world trends and recognizes the interdependence of globalization. He builds bridges for international collaborations, helps promote financial and economic stability, and recommends the necessary and appropriate policy adjustments to ensure economic growth of countries, regions, and the world around. Please join me in welcoming our guest today, Dr. Saleh Nsouli. Hello, Dr. Nsouli. Welcome to Unheard Stories. You need to unmute yourself, Dr. Nsouli. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, good morning, Lubna.
Good morning.
Very good to see you. Let me see, I have a little problem here in my, now it's working properly. Okay, very good. I want, first of all, to thank you very, very, very much for including me in your distinguished series of interviews. This is a particular honor and privilege, and I appreciate it. I have just actually finished reading your book, and I must tell you, it is a fantastic book. You have had an amazing experience. You completed a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. You have done extensive cancer research. And then you moved on to write a widely acclaimed novel. What struck me as I read your book is how concrete your writing style is, the way you vividly develop your characters, and the intriguing plot, all of which reminded me of Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy. But then I was also reading a paper that you have published in a cancer research program on a generation of monoclonal antibodies. And this, if you will permit me, leads me to ask you two questions.
Okay.
The first is your cancer research pioneered a method for cutting off blood supply to cancer cells. What does that involve, and why has it not been adopted more widely? We all have family members who have been hit by cancer, and what you have done seems to provide an avenue for really tackling this terrible disease. The second question I have for you is what prompted you to move away from your promising research career to writing a novel, given that you were originally particularly French educated? I'm surprised how you managed to master the English language to such a level.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question, Dr. Nsouli. I'm incredibly flattered. I truly appreciate the accolade. I'll answer your question very briefly so I don't infringe on the precious time we have ahead of us. My research was focused on angiogenesis and its role in cancer growth and metastasis. Angiogenesis is the term we use to describe the process by which new blood vessels develop. Now, tumors rely heavily on this vasculature to grow and metastasize because blood carries with it food and oxygen. My research was on finding a way to starve the tumor by cutting off that blood supply. I developed an antibody, like you said, that interferes with the process of angiogenesis. Now, what's challenging about that is the fact that there are tens of genes and proteins involved in the process, and the list keeps getting longer as we move on with science. And we recently found out that angiogenesis is not even a local phenomenon like we used to think. So distant players are also involved. So much research remains to be done, Dr. Nsouli, to get the full understanding of angiogenesis and its role in cancer. To go to your next question, you mentioned Charles Dickens. And that's very interesting you mentioned him, because Dickens once said, and I quote him, when I sit down to my book, some power shows it all to me. And I don't invent it, but I see it and I write it down, unquote. And that's exactly how it was for me. I wrote Where Will My Heart Beat in form of a novel because I think stories have a profound effect on people. They can take a powerful message and make it easy to get across. The story is metaphysical and visionary, and that's because I believe there is a whole dimension to the human experience that, at least for now, with what we have in science, cannot be explained or reduced to a mathematical equation. To think otherwise, Dr. Nsouli, would be stripping ourselves from a form of intelligence that is infinite, immeasurable, and that makes each one of us so unique. Thank you for your questions again. I appreciate your interest in my work.
Well, it's a very inspiring work altogether. I'm very sorry that we have lost you to novel writing from the research, given how promising your research was.
That will always be there, Dr. Nsouli.
Very, very inspiring.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Let's go straight to my first question, shall we? Okay. In today's modern societies, Dr. Nsouli, there are two major economic systems, capitalism and socialism. In practice, no economic system is purely either or, but rather some combination of both systems. From your own experience, Dr. Nsouli, is there an effective, more or less fair economic system out there?
Wow. This is the million-dollar question. I wish there was a clear answer.
Yeah.
In fact, when you use the word fair, it raises the question of what would be the definition of fair. Mm-hmm. And I cannot think of an economically meaningful definition of the word fair. It very much depends on your perspective. Mm-hmm. As you noted, there's a wide range of systems these days with varying degrees of capitalism and socialism. But what has been proven is that the market-oriented system is economically the most efficient one. Now, rather than going into a debate as to the merits of capitalism versus the merits of socialism, let me tell you what I think are the elements of a good system. First, I would say, and most importantly, is that the country should have a representative democracy with free and transparent elections. Mm-hmm. It should also have high quality and efficient government institutions. Mm-hmm. It should have the rule of law, including an independent judiciary. It should have free speech. It should have a tax system with equitable tax distribution across income groups. It should provide social protection, including health and education, and a safety net for the poor and disadvantaged. Mm-hmm. And it should also be focused on climate change policies. In fact, this morning, I was reading what the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, just said ahead of the COP26 climate meeting. He said, without courageous action on climate change, world civilization could collapse as swiftly as the ancient Roman Empire, ushering in a new dark age. So these are, to me, the elements of a good system. And then you can judge any system, I would say, by looking at these elements.
Yes, so true. I mean, it's unrealistic to think we can create a utopia out there because there are inherent flaws in every society. But like you said, we can end the political brinkmanship over whether or not there should be some government intervention or regulation, and focus on combining the best features of both systems, like the ones you just laid out for us.
Yes.
Dr. Nsouli, there is a continuing divergence within nations and between nations on wealth and poverty that is causing wealth and income to be increasingly concentrating at the top. Now, political power usually follows the same trend and also concentrates at the top. As a result, the income gap widens and people lose trust in their institutions. How dangerous a recipe is that to the economy of a country on the one hand and the global economy on the other?
Well, certainly this is not a simple question. It can be quite dangerous, no question about it. But let's focus on two issues. Mm-hmm. One is the divergence between nations. And second, the problem of income distribution within countries, which are the two issues embedded in your question. On the divergence between nations, I would say that growth and employment depend on the soundness of institutions. That is the economic framework, political stability, the regulatory framework, and the openness of the economy. There are a lot of studies, including some that I have done, that show that countries with sound institutions have flourished, whereas countries with weak institutions have lagged behind. Countries that pursued sound macroeconomic policies and implemented structural reforms also flourished. The others that did not lagged behind. This underscores the need for sound macroeconomic and structural policies. But developing countries need technical support and financial support from the advanced countries and from international organizations. At the same time, international aid remains minimal, and it needs to be increased massively to close the gap over time between countries. On the issue of income distribution internally, I would say that countries that follow growth-oriented policies increase living standards and promote employment, narrowing the income gap. The regulatory environment of these countries, the tax system, the social protection system, including education and health, can help improve income distribution. But this is not simple. But I would say it can be done with the determination of the countries.
Thank you. Yes. Well, you've published at length about the topic, Dr. Nsouli, in particular on how the prosperity of a country is heavily dependent on fair, stable, and prosperous institutions, and it applies to the world too. Now, these institutions become exceptionally important, Dr. Nsouli, when we face global threats, such as climate change you talked about, and how much of an economic imbalance it's creating. COVID-19 came as a wake-up call. It revealed how vulnerable the world is today and in face of these threats and how fragile the global economy is. Do you see a way, Dr. Nsouli, for governments and companies to reimagine a more resilient global economy that could withstand such a threat? And can the IMF play a role in that?
Indeed, I think your question is so important at this point in time. The world was totally unprepared. 17 million people across the world have died so far, and Many are still dying. COVID-19 exposed the fragility, but also the resilience, as well as the divergence between countries. Now, on the issue of resilience, let's look at world economic output. World economic output dropped by 3.3% in 2020, but is quickly recovering. It is now estimated that world economic output will rise by 6% in 2021. And there are two key factors behind this development. One is the quick development of vaccines, the improvements in technology that have allowed this. And second, the fiscal support in most industrial countries. But, and this is a very important part, the recovery is exposing structural bottlenecks in industrial countries and generating inflationary pressures. The recovery is also uneven, with developing countries lagging behind. In fact, developing countries suffer the most because of their limited health systems, shortage of vaccines, and their inability to provide fiscal support. I was just reading the Global Preparedness Report, which was just issued, and it looked at the lessons we can draw from this pandemic, as well as made recommendations. And I think it made 6 very important recommendations. The first is to have an international agreement on health emergency preparedness and response. The second is to strengthen the World Health Organization. Yes. The third is to create an agile health emergency system. The fourth is to establish a collective financing mechanism for preparedness. The fifth is to ensure engagement of civil society and the private sector. And the sixth is to strengthen monitoring and accountability. But I would emphasize 3 additional points. I think there is a need to establish an early warning system, nationally and internationally. This is paramount to avoid the emergence of future pandemics. The second point that I would add would be to provide financial assistance to developing countries to help them improve their monitoring and health systems. And the third is when a crisis like the one that happens, that resources should be shared equitably across countries, including vaccines. Mm-hmm. Now, the IMF can help through advice on strengthening macro policies and financial and technical assistance for capacity building to foster the resilience that you're talking about. In fact, the IMF has already integrated climate change in its surveillance work, and that will be very important because the yearly consultations that happen with countries will focus on the issue of climate change and as well on the issue of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Sticking to the subject of IMF, you had a nearly 40-year career at the IMF, Dr. Nsouli, and held many distinguished positions, the most renowned of which was director of the offices in Europe. In broad terms, Dr. Nsouli, what is the IMF? Can you define it to us, for us?
Yes.
And when,
yes.
When and why? Yes, go ahead.
A lot of people don't know exactly what the IMF is. It's a little bit of a mysterious institution.
Yeah. And
for many years, actually, the IMF did want to stay in the background. Mm-hmm. It was established in 1944, after World War II. Mm-hmm. The world was suffering from this instability of the international monetary system. Mm-hmm. So the IMF was founded with its main mission being to ensure the stability of the international monetary system. For this purpose, it has four main functions. One is surveillance. It has to monitor and advise countries on economic and financial conditions and on their policies. And it does this also at the regional and at the world levels. The second is to provide financial assistance to support sound policies and reforms and cushion unexpected shocks. The third is to provide technical assistance to help countries formulate reforms and policies. And the fourth is capacity building through training of government officials and the provision and stationing of experts in the countries to help build capacity. Now, a lot of people don't differentiate very well between the IMF and the World Bank. So let me make it very simple and very brief. The IMF focuses on macroeconomic issues. And when we talk about macroeconomic issues, we are talking about the government budget, we are talking about monetary policy, such as interest rates, we are talking about exchange rates, and so on. And the World Bank focuses on structural issues and projects. But there is a lot of overlap between the two institutions, and there is a lot of collaboration. I have headed a lot of missions, which included the staff from the IMF and from the World Bank, as we were helping countries in the design of macroeconomic stabilization and structural reform programs. So the two institutions are really complementary and they work very closely together.
That's good. That's great. I'm glad they do. We need them both. And your career journey at the IMF is exceptional, Dr. Nsouli. Can you share that with us?
Well, I think I have been very lucky and privileged and fortunate to be involved in all facets of the work of the International Monetary Fund. I was involved in surveillance. I led surveillance missions, identified emerging problems in countries, and proposed possible solutions. I also was involved in the area of financial assistance. I led many missions to negotiate adjustment programs with countries facing economic and financial crisis. And the fund was able to provide assistance in support of these programs. I also was involved with technical assistance. I posted a number of experts in member countries, and I helped establish the Middle East Technical Assistance Center. And I still remember fondly my meeting with Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri at the time, when we were trying to establish this center. And he was extremely supportive and anxious to have the center established in Beirut, and it was established in Beirut, thanks to his support. Yes. I was also involved in capacity building. I served at the IMF Institute in charge of training country officials. And I was involved in establishing two training institutes, one in the Middle East and one in Africa. So as you can see, in all the four mandates of the fund, I was very fortunate to be very much involved. But my job also as director of the European offices involved representing the fund at the institutions of the European Union and regional and international organizations in Europe, including the Bank for International Settlements, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the World Trade Organization, the International Labour Organization, and other UN agencies. I also started in our headquarters office in Paris, organizing and chairing high-level conferences to foster dialogue on policy issues. And I traveled and lectured widely across Europe.
Yes, you did. That's very impressive, Dr. Nsouli. That amounts to decades of hard work and commitment. It helped you recognize the world as a community, but it all started in childhood. Growing up, you were raised to belong to the world rather than to a specific country. Your father was the ambassador, the Lebanese ambassador to several countries. And naturally, you were able to explore and savor many ways of life. What was that experience like for you, Dr. Nsouli, and how did it shape you to be, shape the man you developed to be?
Well, I can tell you that I always think it was a unique and challenging experience to grow up in Lebanese embassies across the world. Though I visited Lebanon frequently, but I didn't, growing up, live for a long time in Lebanon. I think that experience implanted in me three key things. One is the understanding of different cultures. Two, a consciousness of living in one interdependent world. And three, a strong love for Lebanon and the Lebanese as one people. I never heard from my father or my mother any differentiation amongst Lebanese. Everyone that came from Lebanon was a Lebanese, and I always thought of the Lebanese as one people. In fact, I owe it to my father and mother that I idealized Lebanon, and probably because I grew outside of Lebanon. Yeah. And it pains me today to see where Lebanon is and to see how fragmented the country is.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed growing up abroad in many countries. But as I look at Lebanon today, it fills my heart with tremendous sadness.
It fills my heart with that sadness, myself too, Dr. Nsouli. And you talked about fragmentation. One of the first tests of character you experienced was when you came to AUB as a student. That's when you first came in full contact with the Lebanese culture. And that was when you first learned how fragmented the society was, and how that fragmentation extended into the student body at AUB. You went to great lengths back then to help mend that system of division. Can you share that story with us?
Well, given that I had grown outside of Lebanon, my mother, in fact, is the one who deserves all the credit because she insisted that I go to AUB after I finished my GCEs at London and Oxford universities. And that was truly the first time I had a full immersion in Lebanese society, something I had never experienced. I developed wonderful friendships that I still cherish till today. I think my closest friends are those that I met at the American University of Beirut. But I was shocked how fragmented the student body was at the time. You had Nasserites, you had the Kata'ib, you had the Syrian nationalists, and I can go on and on. And what was striking to me coming from outside was that the divide was mostly by religion. Mm-hmm. It is something I never imagined or expected. I was exposed even more to these terrible divisions when I was appointed as editor-in-chief of the student newspaper, Outlook. And this led me to act with friends who thought the same way I thought. We formed the Independent Student Society. The objective of that society was to move away from the divisions and focus and on sectarian divisions, and to really look at Lebanon and the Lebanese as one people. And the interesting thing is that the Independent Student Society very quickly gained momentum. We were elected to seats in various departmental societies. And this enabled me actually to negotiate with President Kirkwood, who was then the president of AUB, the establishment of a student council that did not exist at the time at the American University of Beirut. And I was fortunate enough to be elected to the student council with a very strong independent representation. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, and it saddens me, this growing movement faltered and died when I graduated and left. It showed me the importance of the cult of personality in Lebanon, rather than the principles. It also showed very clearly that there was a lack of a unified Lebanese identity. And I think we are still living today in the tragedy of Lebanon because of the lack of a unified Lebanese identity.
I agree. You said it right, Dr. Nsouli, and our problem today is much deeper than we think. We are living today, like you said, the catastrophic consequences of that fragmentation that is decades old now. Back in 2013, you raised warning signs to avoid the potentially precipitous economic and financial decline in Lebanon. And that's exactly where we are today. What are the key factors you recognized back then, Dr. Nsouli, that gave rise to the current crisis in Lebanon? And how many of these factors are really endogenous to the country? And how many are the spillover effects of a global turmoil that Lebanon has no control over?
Thank you, Lubna, for this question. The crisis in Lebanon, and I want to be very clear about this, was entirely predictable. And what's happening in Lebanon today is not normal. I want to emphasize that. In 2013, I was invited by the Lebanese Economic Society. My friend, Dr. Munir Rashid, invited me to give a keynote address to the society. And in my address, I outlined all the elements that were going to create big problems for the Lebanese economy. And I underscored that there was an urgent need for reforms to prevent a sharp economic and financial collapse. I took the opportunity of being in Lebanon in 2013 and met with the president at the time, the prime minister, the head of parliament, many parliamentarians, and high officials. I warned them and I explained to them that Lebanon could easily face a very sharp and economic and financial collapse. I very much regret to say that nothing, absolutely nothing was done. Yeah. Now, what are the factors? There are too many factors, but I boil it down to two factors. One is the poor governance in Lebanon, particularly the widespread corruption. And the second one, which is related actually to the first one, is the economic and financial mismanagement. I was looking at the governance indicators of the World Bank for Lebanon between 2003 and 2020. And let me share with you the numbers. In terms of government effectiveness, Lebanon's rank among countries fell from the top 50% in the world to the bottom 30% in the world. The control of corruption fell from 30%, which was already abysmal, to 12%. And the rule of law fell from 40% to 20%. These are disquieting numbers. Yeah. And this was reflected in the economic mismanagement. And there are a lot of factors that come into play. But let me highlight four main issues. One is that Lebanon was facing rising fiscal imbalances. The budget was totally out of control. There was a rapid increase in government debt to one of the highest ratios to GDP in the world. Lebanon also introduced a fixed, overvalued exchange rate. And this necessitated very high interest rates to attract foreign exchange to Lebanon. The third factor is the concentration of commercial bank assets in the central bank and in government bills. This reflected poor prudential practices for profits from the part of banks, but it also reflected poor central bank supervision and oversight. And the fourth factor is the electricity company losses, which are estimated at about 40% of government debt. So with all these factors, what triggered the crisis? They were building up over time. The economic and financial conditions were deteriorating. And this led to a loss of confidence. With the loss of confidence, there was a fall of foreign exchange inflows that started depleting foreign exchange reserves in the central bank and in commercial banks. So this is how the crisis was triggered. Were there exogenous factors? Yes. It's a complicated situation. Particularly, I would say, the political instability in the region and in Lebanon, and the inflows of refugees. But looking at the whole picture that I just described to you, it should be clear that the endogenous factors dominated poor governance and economic mismanagement.
Yes, and you predicted it close to a decade ago.
It was obvious, it was predictable.
Yes, and it's very sad to know that, Dr. Nsouli, and that this complex and bleak reality we live in today could have been prevented. The current crisis started in 2019. Now, the situation deteriorated so sharply in 2020 and 2021. How did that happen?
This is the most important question. It shouldn't have happened. Okay. But let's look at how it happened. In late 2019, the crisis led to demonstrations. The crisis had just started. The government resigned. In January 2020, the new Diab government was formed. It was formed to tackle the crisis. But the Diab government took no corrective action, despite the pandemic and the port explosion that further complicated the situation. But let's look at what were the counterproductive policies that the Diab government followed. It limited bank withdrawals in an unclear and chaotic fashion, totally undermining confidence in the banking sector. It introduced multiple exchange rates that fostered black markets and imposed implicitly haircuts on depositors. It announced a default on public debt that eroded further confidence. And to top it all, it resigned in August 2020, freezing any potential corrective action and generating uncertainty. Thus, rather than tackling the crisis in 2020, the Diab government managed to amplify the crisis. And let me give you some numbers. Real GDP dropped by an estimated 40% during 2019 and 2020. Inflation at end of 2020 rose to over 200%, putting Lebanon in the category of hyperinflation. The black market exchange rate rose from about 2,000 Lebanese pounds at the end of 2019 to over 20,000 Lebanese pounds at the end of 2020, with dire consequences for the Lebanese population. And there was a loss of foreign exchange reserves in 2020 that is estimated at about $15 billion. This amount is really more than Lebanon can expect in financial aid over the next 3 years if it undertakes reforms. Lebanon and the Lebanese have suffered from severe shortages of food, fuel, electricity, medicines, medical equipment, and basic necessities. And on top of all this, the brain drain has accelerated. I was talking to some friends recently. They told me we are having problems even seeing our doctors because most of the medical doctors have left the country. Now, at the same time, with all this going on, the Diab government managed to get the world confidence to plummet dramatically. The French foreign minister has characterized Lebanon as the sinking Titanic. The World Bank ranked the Lebanese crisis as one of the worst three since the 19th century. And Dr. De Schutter of the UN Human Rights Council, I just read what he said this morning. He said, Lebanon is going through one of the worst economic crises in world history. In just 2 years, multidimensional poverty has doubled from 42% to 82%, with nearly 4 million people facing deprivation in education, healthcare, public utilities, housing, assets, or employment and income. That, regrettably, is where Lebanon is today.
Yes, Dr. Nsouli, it's not a good image. Do you see a ray of hope? And if Lebanon were to take immediate corrective measures, Dr. Nsouli, to prevent further deterioration of the economic and financial situation, what would these measures be? And would they be enough to restore the confidence you were talking about, especially in the banking system?
Yes, I would say there is a ray of hope. We have a new government. I know that the president and the prime minister appear to be serious about reforms. Now, the deputy prime minister, Saleh M, is a very capable and experienced economist with whom I worked at the IMF. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Abdullah Abu Habib, is also a highly capable and experienced World Bank economist. So you have a good team in place and a team that should be able to move forward. But, and I cannot emphasize how important this fact is, there is no time to waste. The government has to exploit the confidence and optimism it generated when it was formed. They need, as you mentioned, to take immediate, obvious corrective actions. And they need to elaborate a sound, comprehensive reform program. You asked me about the immediate actions. Let me list 6 actions that the government can do very, very quickly. The first one is to unify and float the exchange rate. The second one is to allow withdrawals in Lebanese pounds from commercial banks at the market exchange rate without limits, not on the basis of an artificial exchange rate. The third is to complete promptly the central bank audit. We need to have transparency. The fourth is to put in place a meaningful social safety net in collaboration with the World Bank. A lot of the Lebanese are suffering today, and this social safety net is critical. And the fifth is to initiate quickly the reform of the electricity sector. The sixth would be to complete and announce in 30 days a comprehensive reform program. Let me here add that I don't see the reason why it should take months and months and months to elaborate a comprehensive reform program. In all my career in the fund, over 40 years, whenever I have gone to a country to negotiate a reform program, if the authorities were serious and willing, we were able to complete all the work in 2 weeks, and they could start implementing the program. Now, if these 6 actions are done, This will start to restore confidence, but it's far from a solution. It is the beginning. We are dealing with a crisis that's almost unprecedented. I think Lebanon needs a medium-term reform program that would involve at least the following elements: a complete change in fiscal and monetary policies, including the introduction of a new currency after the hyperinflation. We cannot keep talking about millions and millions of dollars, of Lebanese pounds, in order to go and buy a few liters of gasoline. There has to be a commitment to a unified market-determined exchange rate. There has to be a restructuring of the banking sector to restore its soundness. And wide-ranging structural reforms need to be introduced, including in the electricity sector. But most importantly, in my view, what Lebanon needs is a comprehensive governance reform, particularly on corruption, and the establishment of a complete system of social protection that does not exist today.
Your message is clear, Dr. Nsouli. Thank you. Everyone in Lebanon is talking today about the IMF playing a critical role in helping tackle the economic crisis in Lebanon. Has Lebanon started negotiating with the IMF? And will the IMF help Lebanon? If so, how and how much?
As far as I know, Lubna, there have been contacts with the intention of moving to negotiations. Lebanon's executive director, Dr. Mahmoud Mahdeen, just returned from Lebanon, where he discussed with the authorities the importance of proceeding with the negotiations with the International Monetary Fund. Yes, the IMF can help, and it can help mainly in three folds. It can help in program formulation, in designing the program. It can provide direct financial assistance, and it can catalyze donor aid in support of the reforms. But let's not forget also, everybody's talking about the IMF. The World Bank can also help. The World Bank can play an important role in the design of structural reforms. It can also provide direct financial assistance, and it can help in the mobilization of donor aid. Lebanon needs both the IMF and the World Bank. But Lebanon needs to implement the reforms. And the important word here is implementation. If it fails to implement reforms, the economic situation will deteriorate further with a potential for civil strife. And I say this from experience. Yeah. I saw how this happened in Somalia, where the lack of reforms led to an economic and financial collapse and to civil strife. I hope Lebanon does not follow in the footsteps of Somalia. In fact, I would say Lebanon today stands at the edge of a cliff. Either it reverses direction or it falls off the cliff. I always used to say to my colleagues, when negotiations on a reform program broke down in a country, every country has the sovereign right to self-destruct. I sincerely hope Lebanon does not exercise that sovereign right.
I sincerely hope the same, Dr. Nsouli. That brings me to the end of my questions. Thank you so much for answering them. And
thank you, Lubna, for giving me the opportunity and for allowing me to be on your very important program.
Thank you for being here. Managing Lebanon's situation is a Herculean task, apparently, with critical deadlines and existential threats. But we are not going to lose hope, are we, Dr. Nsouli?
I hope not. I hope not. That's why I told you there is a ray of hope, but there isn't much time. If this government doesn't act now, then things will deteriorate very rapidly.
Yes, Dr. Nsouli, thank you. Can we take a few questions from our audience?
Yes.
Okay, now for those who wish to ask Dr. Nsouli a question, you know the drill already. You can leave it in the chat box or you raise your hand using the reactions button on the bottom of the screen. We have several. Let's get started. You have one from Hadi Nsouli. I'm going to ask you to unmute, Hadi. Go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
These are.
How are you, Dr. Nsouli? I have a question regarding the first bit that you said about how we should tackle inequality. I'm sure you're aware of Pareto's laws of distribution, how things just tend to go to one side, and that's just a natural occurrence in almost everything, not just economics. Even with higher living standards, there's relative deprivation, which won't end social disorder. Finally, the culture, business culture. I see it a lot where everyone wants to be a ruthless businessman, and we drive for profits rather than helping. So, I mean, humans are naturally competitive. So how do we get around that so we can actually take the first steps to work together as a human race, which we've never done before?
Thank you, Hadi, for these two very important questions. I think we have never had the pleasure of meeting before, and I can see that you are part of my family as well.
Yeah, I am.
On the issue of income distribution, I wouldn't be as negative as you make it sound. I think in countries that have good institutions in place, in countries that have an equitable tax system, you can address the issue of income distribution. Now, do you want everyone in the country to have the same income so that you equalize income for everybody? That will never work. The issue is really to provide opportunities and to enable people to meet their basic needs, as well as have the employment opportunities that would open for them new vistas and live comfortably. So I would not aim at a complete equality of income across everybody, but rather at having an equitable system that would help avoid acute maldistribution of income. On the issue of business culture and profits, I would go back to Adam Smith. And I would say that profits are the element that drive the free market. And if the free market is working properly, then we all benefit from that. The idea of interfering in the market always creates problems. Take Lebanon. We had a floating exchange rate for decades. We were amongst the first countries in the world to have a floating exchange rate. When we decided to start intervening in the exchange rate, when we fixed the exchange rate at $1 Lebanese pound to 1,000, at $1 to 1,500 Lebanese pounds, we started creating the problem that we are facing today. So the intervention has to be very carefully calibrated to avoid creating distortions and problems. And look at how now the manipulation of exchange rates, the multiple exchange rates, how they have managed to create smuggling and problems.
Thank you for answering the question, Dr. Nsouli, and thank you, Hadi, for asking. I'm going to ask His Excellency Jean Macaron to unmute himself. Go ahead.
Okay, hi, Dr. Lubna.
Ahlan.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting always distinguished guests such as Dr. Nsouli. And thank you, Dr. Nsouli, for your input about many issues. I have some remarks and one question. You said that you were shocked in 2013 when you came to AUB to give a conference about financial problems in Lebanon. Allow me to say that we have in Lebanon unqualified leaders, and they have the tradition to hate and despise academic people like you. Secondly, you said that we are suffering in Lebanon from shortage of electricity, etc. And what important in Lebanon is that we are suffering from a big shortage of good and qualified leaders. And you said about when you answered Dr. Lubna about is there any hope in Lebanon? Let me say that you mentioned about that we have a new cabinet and capable minister like Dr. Saad Shemi and our Minister of Foreign Affairs. I met with Dr. Saad Shemi in Kuwait. He's indeed a good economist. But let me say that such as Dr. Saadi and other ministers, we have good ministers, but they are in a bad place and they are in a very dirty environment. My question to you, Dr. Nsouli, since you were a director of the IMF, and you know all economies is about or are about the mend or the reduce the gap between the poor and rich. My question, to what extent the IMF succeeded in reducing the gap between poor and rich in the whole world? Thank you.
Very good question. Very, very good question. I think the idea of reducing the gap between the poor and the rich is a very important one that should be pursued. I have made the point that you need to have good governance. You have to have a good tax system. You have to have a free market economy that is working well, but with safeguards. These are important elements that would help reduce the gap over time between the poor and the rich. I do not espouse the idea that everyone should have an equal income at the end when we finish achieving the objective of reducing the gap. The idea is to afford hardworking people the possibility of living a decent and comfortable life, and to avoid an excessive accumulation of resources by the very rich people. And I think you have a very active debate on this issue right now in the United States. And we'll see how it's going to be resolved. But what the IMF can do, and this is very important, is help the countries put in place policies that generate employment and growth and raises per capita income. At the same time, we have experts in tax policy that visit the countries and help the countries put in a tax system that helps redistribute to the extent possible wealth and income. This is what I can say in response to your answer.
Thank you, Dr. Nsouli, for taking that question. You predicted, somebody's saying, Dr. Nsouli, the question is coming from Talat Kaptan. He's saying you predicted well 10 years ago. How about the next 10 years? Where do you see us?
I would say that it all depends at this point on this government. I think we have reached the brink. We will fall off the cliff if we don't move now. So I would say in the next few months, depending on what this government does, either Lebanon starts on the road to recovery or Lebanon falls off the cliff.
Okay, that's a warning. I'm gonna ask you, Lina, to unmute yourself and ask your question directly.
Yes, hello, Dr. Nsouli. Thank you very much for a very informative speech. Nice to meet you. My question, simple question. I happen to be looking at some of Sarah Shea's work, Thieves of State and On Corruption in America. And I'm just sort of fascinated by these templates that she puts together on specific countries on how corruption takes place. And I'm thinking, how do you break this cycle? I mean, and we look at these politicians, ما عندهم مصلحة. They don't have a vested interest really in breaking it because they've made fortunes on the back of the state and on the back of the people. So anyway, I just wanted to hear your opinion on Sarah Shea's and some of the literature she writes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would say that in the case of Lebanon, at this point, it is really up to the population, and the elections are coming up soon, to elect the right people that truly represent the interests of the people and of Lebanon as a whole. I always think to myself that at this point, as Lebanese, when we start thinking of ourselves as Sunnis, as Maronites, as Druze, as Shiites, we forget that we are all aboard the Titanic. If the Titanic sinks, we will all sink together. And there is a need for a change in mentality. I very well recall that my father, who was an educator before he became an ambassador, used to say that we need to start with the educational system in Lebanon. I can tell you, when I went to AUB in 1966, I had a lot of friends initially who were Maronites. I never even realized they were Maronites. And one of them, when he came to know me well, looked at me and told me, Saleh, you don't look like a Muslim. And he had studied at the Frere of Jamaiz. So I think we have to start with the educational system. We need leadership in Lebanon that will start bringing all the Lebanese together and stop these meaningless divisions. This is all I can say in response to your question.
Change the story at school. Change the story that's being told.
Yes.
Complete reform. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to have, I lost Rafiq. I have Hadi with a question. Go ahead, Hadi. Unmute yourself.
Hi, I have another question.
Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Nsouli, so so every country is aiming for growth, but I don't find it logical that there can be infinite growth. And there's this cycle, they call it the secular cycle, where just we grow. After World War II, most of the world was destroyed, so it had only one place to go but up. And have we right now reached the peak where we kind of exhausted the capability, the capacity to grow even more, or are we about to? If that makes more sense. That's my question, basically. Thank you.
I don't think we can ever say that we have exhausted the capacity to grow. I think unless we really indulge in the self-destruction, the capacity to grow is infinite. But we have a big issue to deal with, and that is the climate change. How do we balance the growth with the right technology to avoid climate change from putting a brake on economic growth?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nsouli. I have several questions for you here in the chat box. Any thoughts on the future of the IMF and central bank? Nida Al-Andari is asking, the most recent issue of the Economist is painting a somewhat bleak future.
Of what? Of the IMF?
IMF and central bank. Maybe the relationship between IMF and our central bank.
Oh, and the Lebanese central bank.
Yes, maybe that's the question.
I am not privy to the relationship right now between the IMF and the central bank.
Mm-hmm.
What I understand is that the central bank is working closely with the whole team that's negotiating or trying to start negotiations with the IMF. Clearly, in every country, whenever I've gone to negotiate a program, there are certain institutions in the country that are more hesitant than others. But the IMF's job is to collaborate with all the institutions. And I'm hopeful that the collaboration between the IMF and the central bank will continue to be a good one. And it's in the interest of Lebanon to have such a good collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. You have one from Taline Nsouli. She's saying this was an amazing session. My question, how can we solve a problem if there is fragmentation within the government in regards to having several parties that all have different motivations and interests? So there may not be one leading decision or plan to be acted upon in unison.
Very good question, Taline. I think that the dire economic situation in Lebanon should bring everybody together in principle. As I said, it is not that the Sunnis or the Shiites or the Maronites are going to think alone. We are all going to think together. And I'm hoping very much that this will generate much more of a consciousness that we need to have a country with a healthy economy and that we need to put in place reforms that benefit everybody, not only one fragment of the population.
Great answer. Thank you so much. I think, Rafiq is back. I would like to take his question. He's been very patient. Go ahead, unmute yourself, Rafiq, and ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Lubna, for taking my call. I had a spotty connection today, so I kept dropping in and out. And thank you, Dr. Nsouli, for a very informative presentation. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Lubna, thanks again for having such a distinguished guest. My question is, Dr. Nsouli, in 2013, 2014, you warned the Lebanese head of government about this collapse that's going to happen of the economy of Lebanon. But how about the Lebanese, regular middle-class Lebanese citizen who was duped into putting their life savings into this banking system that was paying 100 times what other banks in Western countries, in the United States and in Europe, were paying for savings account? Did anybody warn them that, hey, be careful, don't put all your life saving in Lebanon? And they're now suffering. So that's the gist of my question.
Okay, I will tell you from my own experience. When I went to Lebanon in 2013, which was the last time I visited Lebanon, a lot of my family members came to me exactly with that question. And I told each and every one of them, I wouldn't put a penny in the banking system in Lebanon. This is a disaster waiting to happen. And I remember also a discussion with a very high-ranking politician, I will not mention the name, where he told me when I was warning him, he said, look, everyone keeps saying everything is going to collapse. We have heard these warnings before and nothing happens. And I told him, look, you have a rubber band and you keep pulling the rubber band and you say nothing is happening. You pull it more and you say nothing is happened. You pull it more and you say nothing has happened. At one point, the rubber band is going to give way. And the rubber band has given way. Now, as to my friends and relatives who consulted me in 2013, and I warned them, I can tell you that today they are suffering from the fact that they cannot get their money out of the banks. And I am deeply concerned that we don't destroy the banking system in Lebanon. We need to restore confidence. We have to be very careful not to take away the resources of the depositors, because that will permanently damage confidence in the banking system. And we need a well-functioning banking system in Lebanon. That should be a pillar of the reform in order to revive the economy. Without a well-functioning banking system, the Lebanese economy cannot be rebuilt. As I said before, there was a failure of prudential management on the part of banks. There was a failure of prudential and supervision on the part of the Central Bank of Lebanon. And this is really most regrettable. We need reforms, both at the level of the commercial banks and at the level of the central bank, to ensure proper regulation and oversight of commercial banks. Now, one of the things that I have been arguing repeatedly is that we should now allow the Lebanese to withdraw in Lebanese pounds whatever amount they want at the market exchange rate. If the market exchange rate is 20,000, they should be able to withdraw from their deposits in dollars at an exchange rate of 20,000. If you have the choice to withdraw Lebanese pounds or dollars, and the exchange rate is the same inside the bank and outside the bank, you will be indifferent whether you get Lebanese pounds or you get dollars. And you need to have a currency reform to start signaling to the world that you are doing something very, very, very serious. This is why I don't think the task of rebuilding the Lebanese economy is an easy one. And that's why I think the next few months will be critical. If this government does not move, we are going to be looking at a much bleaker picture later on.
Dr. Nsouli, you've been very generous with the time. The timing of this conversation couldn't be better. We are more desperate than ever. And this is the time when it becomes imperative for all of us to pull together as one nation. Thank you for inching us closer to the truth, Dr. Nsouli.
And thank you very much, Lubna, for hosting me. And I want to thank everybody who attended and those who asked questions for these important questions that were raised. Thank you very, very much.
Yes, thank you. To everyone in the audience, we are so grateful you joined us. Please don't forget to connect with us again. Unheard Stories is a monthly event. It falls on the last Saturday of every month. Our next episode is scheduled for Saturday, November 27th. And this time we are doing something different. We will be hearing from a panel of American-born young men and women with Lebanese immigrant parents on how they adapt to life in the US, fare academically and behaviorally, and contribute richness to their American communities. The panel will include people of different backgrounds and interests and will shed light on the unique identity of a generation whose members are continuously learning how to reconcile their inherited culture with the American ways of life. A sneak peek into early next year, I am excited to announce that I will be hosting Dr. Ardem Pataputian, our Nobel Prize laureate for 2021 in the fields of physiology or medicine, and Dr. Charles El-Ashi, former director of JPL and vice president of Caltech. To watch past events, receive the videos and tapings, and know about our future ones, you can follow me on social media. Thank you for bringing us into your home and making us part of your Saturday. Goodbye for now.